Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I'll be your host. I just wanted to check in real quick and say hello. I'm going to turn off my video because you didn't come to see me. You came to learn about John F. Kennedy. So let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us. This is the John F. Kennedy Assassination 57th Anniversary History Livestream Memorial Program. For those of you who've not been on one of our programs before, we always welcome people to introduce themselves. You can tell us your first name, where you're connecting from, and any connections you have to the Kennedys, and or if you've been to the Dallas site that we're going to be talking about. Just curious to know about that. In fact, while we're waiting, why don't we actually ask where people are from? So we're a Washington, D.C. based organization, but we always get people connecting from all over the place. So if you wouldn't mind, let us know, are you in the Washington, D.C. metro area, in Texas, somewhere else in the U.S., or outside the U.S.? And I'll share those results in just a second. I'll leave that up for a few seconds and let you fill that out. Okay, I'll give people a few more seconds. Okay, I will go ahead and share the results. So we have a pretty good sized group from the Washington, D.C. area, about a third. Only a few people are from Texas. We have a lot of people outside the D.C. and Texas areas, and then a big international group. So thank you all for joining us today. And let me go ahead and close that out. And I want to give a shout out to our homeschool group that is joining us this evening. So thanks you for participating with us. And again, if you're interested, you can use the Q&A to introduce yourselves. You can tell us your first name, where you're connecting from, and if you have any connections to the Kennedys, and or if you've been to the site in Dallas before. The Q&A comments aren't public at this time, so we will be the only ones to see those, we being the moderators of this program, unless we end up sharing those with you. Just FYI for that. So if you haven't used Zoom before, we don't have time to do like a full Zoom demonstration, partially because we only have so much time together, and then also partially because the features are dependent on the type of device you're using. So a Windows PC might be a little bit different than an Apple iPad, and that might be a little bit different than an Android phone. However, usually the two things that people want to adjust the most are either the sound volume, and I'm speaking in my normal voice. We did a sound test earlier. Everything seems to be working okay. The other thing that people sometimes want to adjust is the video display, so that the screen that's showing either the slides or the videos takes up the entire screen and not just a portion of it. If you need to fix that or tweak that, you can usually click on something called View Options, and there's a side-by-side mode. But again, if you have any troubles with that, you can just kind of play around with the settings. Let's see, if you feel free at any point in time this evening to type your questions and comments in the Q&A. Again, that would just be seen by our leadership team at the moment. And if you have any technical problems, go ahead and close it out. Oh, hold on one second, I have to tweak something. If something pops up on your screen, like the poll, which I just closed out, or my name, Robert Kellerman, you can either minimize that, you can hit the X button to make it go away, or if worse comes to worse, you can drag it down to the bottom of the screen. So thanks for the heads up on the Q&A. And again, if you run into any technical problems, let us know. Every once in a while, the Zoom site will kind of go into like a degraded mode, and it'll kind of stall out, and we have to restart the session. So if you have any issues at all with the Zoom, we'll just be reconnecting. That usually does not happen, but every once in a while it does. So you can be on the lookout for that. But hopefully we should be good to go this evening. And we're also going to attempt to broadcast this program on Facebook Live. So if you have to jump off early, or if you want to watch this again, we'll give you instructions on how to do that a little bit later. So for those of you not familiar with us, we're Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We're a nonprofit community organization. And for those of you I haven't met myself, my name is Robert Kellerman, and I will be your host. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's first, before we talk about the actual assassination of John F. Kennedy, which happened on this date, November 22nd, 1963. Let's go over kind of some contextual information to kind of set the stage, so to speak. In history, it's usually helpful and important to kind of understand the context that things take place in, and this particular event is no different. So I really like this chart. It shows the percentage of households in the United States that had televisions. And if you look where the red box is, or the red bar, you can see in 1950, the percentage was a little bit less than 10% of the households in the United States had televisions. You fast forward 10 years to 1960, and 1960 is the year that President Kennedy won his election to move into the White House as president. You can see the percentage that year is 85%. So there's this huge increase in the amount of households that have televisions in the years leading up to the beginning of the Kennedy administration. And why is that important? Well, because so much of President Kennedy and his administration is really centered on things that are either captured on video or broadcast on television. So take, for instance, the Kennedy-Nixon debate, which many historians feel like if those wouldn't have taken place, John F. Kennedy wouldn't even become president because he did such a good job during the debates and won over a lot of independent voters. So really the kind of key moment in his presidential campaign is a television moment. Fast forward to when he takes his inaugural, the kind of the key, probably the most famous line from President Kennedy comes from this other TV or video moment when he says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." But again, a moment captured on video and replayed over and over again on television. If you think about his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, probably her most famous moment before going to Texas was her TV tour of the White House. Again, another video moment. And then even President Kennedy's death and his funeral also captured on video and then broadcast on TV. So really, the Kennedys, by many accounts, are considered the first modern first couple. And you could talk a lot about their use of other media beyond video and TV, things like photography and magazines and newspapers and et cetera, et cetera. But suffice to say, a lot of the Kennedy administration from the time where he's campaigning all the way up until his death and funeral are captured on video and broadcast on TV, which really kind of gives people more of a connection to the two of them than they had from the prior predecessors. So if you think about, say, Harry and Bess Truman or Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower, can you think about any videos that might come to mind that you've seen of them? Probably really not all that many, because while they did have video back then, TV was not as prominent as it was during the Kennedy administration. So let's talk about their trip to Texas. The sites that they were going to be visiting on this Texas trip were San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, Dallas, the Lyndon Baines Johnson Ranch, and Austin, Texas. Hold on for 1 second while I check something on my computer real quick. Okay, we'll continue on. Thanks, I just had to check something real quick. So what did the Kennedys do on their last night together at the White House? Their last night was Wednesday, November 20th, 1963. And how they spent that evening was there was a small reception at the White House where they were showing off the Christmas tree that was set up inside of the White House. Now, this isn't the big national Christmas tree that's outside the White House. This is kind of their own personal Christmas tree inside the White House. And so there was this small reception on Wednesday evening, November 20th, 1963. The Kennedys would be departing for Texas the next morning, and they have this reception. So this is somewhat of a well-known photo of the two of them. But again, this is kind of their last public appearance in Washington, D.C. together, and then also their last evening at the White House. Now, throughout the program, there's always a lot of talk or discussion or questions or comments about the Kennedys' marriage. And I'll nip that right in the bud. First of all, I don't really have a strong opinion on their marriage. I usually get a million questions about what I think about it. I'm not judgmental, so I don't have a strong opinion on it one way or the other. Whatever happens between two consenting adults is up to them. However, if you do look at photos of the Kennedys, you oftentimes see them looking at each other very admiringly. So, did they have their challenges? I'm sure they did. But throughout this program, you'll see photos of them. And I put the ones that are kind of cute with a little heart next to them. So you can see how Jackie is looking up at John F. Kennedy in this photo. So again, last night at the White House. And then after they left the reception, they went upstairs and started the process of signing their Christmas cards. So if you think about your president and first lady, you have a huge amount of Christmas cards that you have to sign. Now, if you're younger and in the kind of electronic or digital age, you might not be as familiar with the process of actually sending out Christmas cards. That's kind of more of a thing that's not as common as it was back in the day. But the Kennedys, being president and first lady, they would have had hundreds and hundreds of Christmas cards they would have had to send out. So they start the process early. And so their last evening in the White House, they signed several dozen of the Christmas cards, which never were ended up being mailed for obvious reasons. And then another event that I like to point out that happened 15 weeks prior to President Kennedy being killed took place on August 9th, 1963. Actually, 15 weeks to the day was when their son Patrick died. So Patrick would have been the Kennedy's third child, or he was the Kennedy's third child to be born. But unfortunately, he had a number of health issues, particularly in terms of breathing ailments, and he does not live. He only lived for 39 hours, as you can see on the headline. And so I like to point this out for a couple of reasons. Number one, this was a very traumatic event, both emotionally and physically, for Jacqueline Kennedy. She had a number of health issues come out of this pregnancy. And so after this takes place, she's pretty much recuperating for the next 15 weeks at the White House. As you would expect, there's a lot of mental anguish that goes along with this. John F. Kennedy was also, of course, very distraught, but Jacqueline Kennedy had a lot of medical complications related to the birth of her son. And so she became pretty much a recluse. Not that I don't fault her for that. But that being said, she's really not seen out in public. And the trip to Texas is kind of her first trip, or first kind of significant public appearance with President Kennedy since the death of her son. The other thing that's really striking is the fact that Jacqueline Kennedy is really known for her composure and how she handled herself in the aftermath of President Kennedy's death, which in and of itself is extraordinary, but even more so when you consider just 15 weeks prior, she lost her son. So in a very short period of time, she not only loses a son, but also her husband. This is the Kennedys departing Andrews Air Force Base on the late morning of Thursday, November 21st. They're on their way to Texas. So that's this context for this. So for this program, I have a lot of historical pictures. I spent a lot of time researching the Kennedys, and there's a lot of really fascinating photos that kind of complement what might be, say, common knowledge of the assassination. So let's go through and look at some of these. And again, these are the Kennedys departing from Andrews Air Force Base on their way to Texas. They had a late morning flight on Air Force One. Now, this is the San Antonio International Airport where the Kennedys are going to be arriving. And remember, the Kennedys on this trip, they're going to San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, Dallas, the Lyndon Johnson Ranch, and then they're going to conclude their trip in Austin, Texas. Hold on for just one second. Okay, let's continue on. And they depart Air Force One. Notice how much sunnier and warmer it's looking the end of November. Texas is sunnier and warmer than Washington, D.C. This is a very well-known photo of Jacqueline Kennedy. I'm sure if many of you are kind of familiar with photos of her, you might have seen this one before, because it is a very famous photo of this, but sometimes people don't know what the context is. When she landed in San Antonio to begin the Texas trip. And of course, they're greeted by entourage of supporters and admirers. I'll leave these pictures up for a few seconds. You can kind of take a look and process all that. Big smiles from Jacqueline Kennedy and John F. Kennedy. Getting into the car to take them to their first stop. Now, this is in San Antonio. This is a historical marker that was set up a few years ago, and it basically accounts for the fact that the presidential entourage drove by. Now, note that the spots were switched in the car, the placement of where people sat. So here, let me give you a full closer view. So this is a close-up of the photo. Notice that in this photo, Jacqueline Kennedy is not sitting beside her husband. She's actually sitting in front of Governor Connolly. And so the seating arrangements in these vehicle processions weren't always the same. Sometimes they would mix them up, just depending on circumstances or preferences or whatnot. But again, in San Antonio, any of you who've been down there before, they have this historical marker, the fact that where the presidential entourage drove down the street and get these admiring waves and greetings from people. I love the guy that's on the right side of the photo. He's standing up in the back of his pickup truck waving to the Kennedys. That's pretty cool. And again, this is the day before the assassination. They're heading towards downtown San Antonio, driving through San Antonio, and it's striking to see the number of people that are out looking to see them and waving and cheering as they go by. Notice the people in the upstairs balcony looking down. This is actually the press car that's kind of documenting the event. And then here's the motorcade proceeding down the street. And again, just look at all these people that are out on the streets greeting the Kennedys. Passing through downtown San Antonio. And they end up at an Air Force base. So the purpose of this particular part of the trip was, and I'll talk more about the overall trip's purpose, but this particular part was to visit a Air Force base. In particular, there was a medical facility that the president was going to be dedicating. And then he was also interested in kind of the promoting the space program. So we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Here's Jacqueline with Lyndon Baines Johnson and President Kennedy speaking. Now, when we get towards the end of the program, I have a few snippets of videos to show you of different things. And one of them is a brief snippet of President Kennedy speaking. But for some technical reasons, I'm going to show those at the very end. So you can kind of file this picture away in your memory bank. Then after the speech, the car proceeds to military base, and they get on Air Force One and they head to Houston. And the visit to San Antonio received a lot of favorable press. Thousands give JFK rousing San Antonio welcome, says the headline. And then this is the Dallas Times Herald, says plea for space plan kicks off JFK tour. So at this point in time, you have to realize that man had not landed on the moon, and President Kennedy was proposing a significant monetary investment in the space program, which many people were in favor of, but many people were not. They thought that was not a good use of resources. And so one of the reasons why he went to Texas was to try and drum up support for that initiative, which is kind of amazing, because I would think that most people now that are of a kind of historical orientation would agree that the space program was a very worthwhile endeavor, but at that time, pretty controversial. So the next stop on the trip, and again, this is the same day, this is the day before the assassination, they land in Houston. You can tell the photos, if you're looking at pictures of the Kennedys, and Jacqueline Kennedy and Mr. President Kennedy are wearing the same clothes, you can tell the difference between the San Antonio pictures and the Houston one, because the Houston, they landed later in the day, and so they're in kind of a more shaded type environment. Getting off Air Force One. And you'll notice Jacqueline's got a bouquet of yellow roses. And so the yellow rose is the state flower of Texas. So we're actually gonna be talking about yellow roses compared to red roses a little bit later. So kind of file this picture away in your memory bank, the fact that when Jacqueline lands, she is given a bouquet of yellow roses. There's a close-up. And again, if you see pictures on the internet of them, you can kind of tell the difference between the San Antonio and the Houston ones, depending on the time of day. They arrived a lot later. Of course, there was a lot of supporters, as you would expect. People on hand greeting, saying hello. And I love this look on the President and First Lady's face. They're like, wow, look at all these people that are coming out to support us. So that's really neat that they have that kind of response with the people. And again, remember, Jacqueline had really not been out in public much. And this was actually her first trip since the loss of their son, Patrick. Okay, so they get in the car and the motorcade proceeds to downtown Houston. And again, look at all the people on the side of the road. Then one thing that's funny that people do, it's really interesting. People will take historic photos and they try and line it up with the scene as it looks today. And so this was from a photographer. He took historical pictures, and then he walked around different spots in Houston and lined up where they were taken. So you can kind of get a sense of what the site looks like now. So this is downtown Houston, the kind of the big picture. And then the smaller one is, of course, the Kennedy Motorcade. And then this is another neat one. This is a group of people on the side of the street waiting for the motorcade to drive by, in comparison with how that street looks now. So you see people do this frequently with historical photos, which is pretty neat. And they had a planned visit kind of for President Kennedy to give a formal speech, but they also stopped off kind of a side detour and gave a short speech. And President Kennedy delivered some remarks, and then his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, she actually gave a short speech in Spanish. Some people might not realize that she actually spoke a number of languages. She had given speeches during her time as First Lady in French, Italian, Spanish, in addition to English. And I have a snippet of her speech. It's only maybe like a minute or two long, but I have a snippet of it at the very end if you want to stick around and watch that. Then they board the plane in Houston for Fort Worth. So again, they arrive they depart Washington in late morning. They arrive in San Antonio early afternoon. They stay there for a few hours. Then they're on to Houston. And the evening, they board the flight Air Force One for Fort Worth. And they end up staying at a place called, that time it was known as Hotel Texas. It was the largest, most well-known hotel in the city of Fort Worth. Here's an advertisement for it from back in the day. It's now a Hilton, but back then it was Hotel Texas. And you can actually stay in the presidential suite. It's room 1530 up on the top floor. This is actually the suite that the Kennedys spent their last evening in. So they spent their last night together in Fort Worth, Texas at the Hotel Texas. Now, I know some of you are already asking, wow, Robert, those are nice pictures. Did you take those pictures when you stayed in the presidential suite yourself? No, sorry. That is actually from the hotel. But you can stay there if you want to. I just have not been able to do that just yet, FYI. Then this is a historic photo of what Hotel Texas looked like from around the time of the Kennedys. And so if you look and see, the hotel is on the right side of the photo. And then notice there's this large parking lot in front of the hotel. And then there's a blue arrow. That's the main entrance. So there's it's kind of configured so that it's a square, it's symmetrical. The entrance is right on the bottom floor in the center with the blue, just below the blue arrow. And then there's a large parking lot that used to be there at that point in time. Now, what happens is there's about 3,000 or 4,000 people that are waiting. So the Kennedys check in late at night on Thursday night. So there's a large group of people. They estimate between 3,000 and 4,000 people are waiting outside the hotel. Now, there's no planned events outside the hotel. They're just hoping that they can get a glimpse of the Kennedys. And so John F. Kennedy is told this, and he decides, it'd be a good idea to maybe make a short speech to kind of thank people for coming out. And it was amazing that there was that many people there because it had actually been raining. And so people were standing out in the rain waiting to see if they were going to get a glimpse of President or Mrs. Kennedy. And so he decides to come out. They'd set up a little platform for him, and he gave a short speech basically thanking everyone. Before he did, though, he went through and worked the crowd, and shaking hands with people. You notice if you look, the people have hats and stuff covering their heads because it had been raining, and the rain had kind of cut down to a drizzle and then pretty much stopped when President Kennedy came out. And he goes up and gives his remarks. So this is the next to last speech that President Kennedy ever gave. It was an impromptu speech outside of the Hotel Texas, pretty much in the parking lot for the 3,000 to 4,000 people that had showed up. And then here he is. And again, if you look at the left side, this photo is a little grainy, but if you look at the left side and then the center, you can kind of see the mass of people showing up. And then one thing that I think is funny about this photo, look over to the far right, you can see a couple guys riding horses. So this is down in the downtown area of Fort Worth. And even to this day, you can still periodically people riding horses around. So pretty cool. And President Kennedy delivers his remarks in front of Governor Conley and Vice President Johnson. And they've since set up, a few years ago, they set up a memorial to President Kennedy. And so if you look in this photo, if you look over to the left side, that's actually the hotel. And then at the center is the memorial that was built a few years ago. And if you zoom in, on the left side of this photo, you see some text. That's actually basically just an overview of President Kennedy's and Mrs. Kennedy's visit to Fort Worth. And it has a couple snippets from his speeches that he gave. He gave 2 speeches, one impromptu and one planned. And then here's a historical marker that's just a few steps away. They put the historical marker up first, and then later on they put the memorial. So it says, on the evening of November 21st, 1963, President and Mrs. John F. Kennedy arrived in Fort Worth to spend the night at the Hotel Texas, which would be their last night together. Let's see. Early next morning, President Kennedy made an unscheduled outdoor appearance and surprised a crowd that had gathered here hoping to see him. At breakfast in the hotel, he spoke to 3,000 people, emphasizing Fort Worth's role in defense and aircraft production. He accepted with good humor the city's traditional welcome gift of a locally made Shady Oaks Western hat. The president's trip around Texas, though billed as non-political, was surely brought about by infighting among Texas Democrats. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Following breakfast on November 22nd, 1963, the president and his entourage left the Hotel Texas in a motorcade to Carswell Air Force Base for a short flight to Dallas. On the drive to a luncheon speech in Dallas, President Kennedy was assassinated, bringing shock and grief to Texas, the nation, and the world. So again, they put the historical marker up first in 2006, and then just a few years ago, they built the memorial. This is President Kennedy's last speech. These are remarks he was delivering at the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. So again, he gives 2 speeches, one impromptu outside. This one was a planned one. And if you look over to the bottom left of this photo, you can see Jacqueline Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. You can't see her, but just to the our left of Lyndon Johnson is Lady Bird Johnson. And again, this is President Kennedy's last speech. Here's a photo of them, the famous pink suit. And then they depart the Hotel Texas. Notice that the sun has come out at this point in time, which is a really important part of the story, because had the weather not changed, had it remained kind of drizzly and potentially even raining, they would have closed the top on the convertible. But actually, let me go back and show you the pictures. Notice here, if you look over on the right side, you can see the women that have their hair covered because, again, it had been drizzling. And then if you fast forward to this point in time, look at the sunshine shining on Jacqueline's face. So the weather had changed, and it really plays an important part of the story, because had the weather not changed, the top on the convertible would not have been down. This is them leaving the Hotel Texas. And so what happens is, if you're not familiar with the geography of Texas, Dallas and Fort Worth in some regards are kind of considered like the same metro area, but they're actually a little ways apart from one another. So it was decided that the easiest way to get President Kennedy from point A to point B was to have Air Force One fly from Fort Worth to Dallas Love Field, which is only a few minutes via airplane. So he's boarding the plane at Fort Worth and they're flying to Dallas, but those 2 cities are really, really long ways apart from one another. I guess for our Washington, D.C. friends, it would kind of be like flying from, I don't know, Reagan Airport to Baltimore or something like that. Okay, let's talk about the events that took place in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. So I set up this timeline for you, and as the program goes by, the time slots will fill in down the page. But at 11:38, Air Force One lands at Love Field in Dallas. At 11:50, it takes a few minutes for them to kind of get everyone off the plane and get set up and ready to go. At 11:52, the presidential motorcade leaves Love Field, and at approximately 12:30 p.m., President Kennedy is shot. So less than an hour after landing at the airport. Now, when they arrive in Dallas, just like they had seen in San Antonio, in Houston, and Fort Worth, there are admirers there to greet them. People clapping and cheering and taking pictures and whatnot. However, not everyone was glad to see the Kennedys. This is an interesting picture. The guy's holding a sign that says, "Yankee, go home and take your equals with you." So President Kennedy was really receiving a lot of criticism for handling of different issues, but I don't want you to, the reception that he received was mostly favorable. However, it was not 100% favorable. And if you go to this next slide, this actually talks about this in the Dallas Morning News. You can see this headline. It says, "Storm of political controversy swirls around Kennedy on visit." Now, it might be hard for you to see the details of this newspaper headline if you don't have a big screen, but I'll leave it to you. And to the left of the photo, it says, "Love Field," that's the airport where they were going to be landing, "braces for thousands," meaning thousands of people showing up to greet them. Over on the right side of the photo, it says, "Split state party continues feud." So there's a big split in the Democratic Party, particularly in Texas, for the kind of the far left wing of the party and the kind of more middle of the road. And President Kennedy was trying to navigate through that and kind of appease both sides. And again, there's also a lot of controversy over the fact of his space program, which not everyone had bought into. And then also some of his civil rights activities, being pro-civil rights, was not widely accepted across America. And then if you look down at the bottom, it's really hard to see, but what that is that's actually a map of the route that the motorcade was going to be taking. So if you wanted to do some harm to the president, the map's right there. And that's not all that unusual. I've seen several other trips that President Kennedy took where the route was published ahead of time. And I almost included the San Antonio route was published in the newspaper. I'm not sure about Houston, but I imagine that was as well. So not uncommon for the president's motorcade's route to be published in the newspaper ahead of the visit. Now you might say, well, God, why would they do that? Well, hindsight's 2020, and they hadn't had any kind of issues previously. But again, not all the people are happy to see the Kennedys. Most are, but not all. Now, this is interesting. This is a chart from Gallup, the public opinion poll, and this tracks President Kennedy's approval rating from the time he began his term until the day he died. And if you look, you can see he particularly got some pretty favorable numbers, which is striking because the election of 1960 was very close between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. But he has a pretty high approval rating for most of his time in office. But then you see when you get to 1963, he peaks out at around 76%. At that kind of point in time, he had previously peaked around 83%. But at this kind of year-long span, he peaked at 76%. But then as you go down and follow the progression, look, their approval rating dropped down to 58%. So he had lost quite a bit of support for things like civil rights, the space program, et cetera, et cetera. This is the Kennedys getting off the plane in Dallas at Love Field. This is Mrs. Kennedy being greeted. And you'll notice the woman on the left is holding red roses to give to her. And she hands Jacqueline the bouquet of red roses, which is unusual because Jacqueline, she would later say in an interview, "Every time we got off the plane that day, 3 times, they gave me the yellow roses of Texas." And again, yellow roses are the state flower of Texas. But in Dallas, they gave me red roses. I thought, how funny, red roses. So all the seat was full of blood and red roses. So, you know, there's a lot of irony to the Kennedy's trip and all the different events that took place. The reason why supposedly they gave her red roses because there were all these events taking place in and around Dallas, and they ran out of yellow roses. There were all these events basically centered around the Democratic Party and the fact that President Kennedy was visiting. So they ran out of yellow roses supposedly. So the only ones that they had left were red. But some people tie symbolism into the fact that she received the red roses here and not the traditional yellow ones. Okay, so one thing that's fascinating about the President and First Lady is the amount of planning that goes into one of their trips. And so this is Jacqueline Kennedy's notes, basically outlining what's going to be happening during the days where she's going to be in Texas and what she's going to be wearing. So these are handwritten notes that she made. The one on the left is the earlier part of the trip, and the one on the right talks about her schedule for the Friday, November 26th. And you can see over the far right, pink and navy Chanel suit with navy shoes, navy bag, and white kid gloves. So there's a huge amount of logistics go into planning a president and or first lady trip. It's not just, hey, just grab some stuff out of the closet and let's go. A lot of planning takes place. Now, the pink suit, the Chanel pink suit, the famous, iconic Chanel pink suit. Jacqueline Kennedy had worn it a few times before visiting Dallas. This is her at a preservation kind of press event where she was helping to preserve Lafayette Square, which is across the street from the White House. So this is the year before she goes to Texas, and notice she's wearing the pink suit there. And then this is the same exact event. So the famous Chanel pink suit she had worn that previously before going to Dallas. And I thought this was interesting. This was like a fashion history type of article. So this is a little bit wordy, but let me go ahead and read this because there's just so many, whenever we do our in-person programs in Jacqueline Kennedy, always someone brings up the pink suit and wants to know more about it. So here's the scoop. It says, made of wool, the double-breasted raspberry pink and navy trim-collared suit was matched with a trademark matching pink pillbox hat and white gloves. In the early 1960s, the Chanel suit was a wardrobe staple of upwardly mobile American female. It evoked a powerful image of a sophisticated, intelligent, and independent modern woman and could fit almost every daytime occasion that required a woman to dress stylishly. Given that the Chanel suit was a strong statement of an independent woman, it is balanced by the color pink, which has an element of traditional femininity. So again, at this point in time, women are kind of asserting their right to be independent and career focused, but some men may be taken aback by that. So this is a great combination of the fact you have the suit combined with the color pink, so that men that are chauvinistic maybe is not put off by that. So kind of funny that they included that in the history, or just to really say funny, kind of unusual that they would need to include that in the history, because women have come a long way. Okay, this is also interesting, most of the American public viewing pictures of the presidential couple on television and in newspapers would not have known the color of the suit, given that at the time, TV news and newspapers were in black and white. The color of the suit did not become widely known until the publication of color photos in Life magazine's JFK Memorial issue of November 29th, 1963, which came out 7 days after he was killed. Eventually, the suit was never cleaned. It was basically put in a box and was given to the National Archives. And per an agreement with Carolyn Kennedy, Mrs. Kennedy's daughter, it will not be seen by the public until at least 2103. It's a very touching memento, and I'm not sure what the history is, but you won't be seeing it at the Smithsonian or anywhere else anytime in the near future, probably not in our lifetimes. But if you have to think about it, what are some of the iconic clothing items in American history? And there maybe is no more iconic item than this. If it's not number one, it's definitely in the top 5 or 10 for sure. If you can think of anything that would beat it, please let me know. And this was a Chanel advertisement, and the black and white photo. I believe this picture was taken in London, and you can see the woman here on the second from the left is wearing a version of the Chanel suit. There's a close-up view. And they're getting off the plane and greeting people. It's difficult looking at these pictures for me personally, because you know what's about to come in the next few minutes. But interesting nonetheless. And the big smiles. And again, notice how the sun has come out for them. Now, this is a crowd photo. This is a little bit hard to digest, So I put the arrows in here. So basically there's a fence, there's a chain link fence. If you look to the left of the photo, kind of towards the bottom, you can see a little bit of the chain link fence. And then President Kennedy is on the left side of the photo. I put a blue arrow down below him so you can see where he's at. And then kind of in the middle, there's a pink photo. There's a pink arrow pointing down to Jacqueline Kennedy in her pink suit. The pink arrow is right below the Confederate flag that was flying at the time. So again, a huge number of people show up at Love Field to greet the Kennedys. Then this is where they're heading to. This is a building called the Trade Mart. So President Kennedy was scheduled to deliver a speech here, a lunchtime speech. And so that's where they're going to. They're leaving the airport at Love Field and they're on their way to the Trade Mart, which is near downtown Dallas. Okay, let's talk about the motorcade. President Kennedy getting in the motorcade. Notice the red roses in between the president and Mrs. Kennedy. You can see a contingent of Secret Service and press and airport personnel in the back of the car to the center of the photo. And then behind that, you can see the Air Force One. This is the car. These are pictures when it was built, a Lincoln Continental, specially designed for the president. Now, it was not unusual for the president to travel in an open convertible. In fact, a number of presidents had done this in the past. I'm going to give you a picture. So they're going to give you a few examples of John F. Kennedy doing this. This is while he was still a senator. This is a picture when he was running for president. This is another photo, which is cute. You look how happy the two of them look. Jackie's got her famous pearls on. This is at a parade. And I could have easily pulled up dozens of different pictures of the Kennedys riding in these open vehicles. This was just something that people did back at that point in time. There was a thought that there's really a limited amount of any type of risk doing this. So there's always that question of why were they traveling in an open convertible? That could not possibly have been safe. Well, that's people looking through this situation in kind of a 2020 context. If you go back to 1963, it did not seem that unusual. Here's another photo of them. This is right before the election. This is a cute photo. You talk about the Kennedys and their marriage and, oh, why did she stay married to him? She must have been miserable. Oh, terrible. Oh. And listen, I don't know what the story was between the two of them, but I just like to show this picture. Look at how in love they seem. And he's brushing her hair off to the side. I forgot to mention, after their son Patrick died, that 15-week span before he was killed, people that were close to them or were spending time with them remarked at how that event really seemed to change the dynamic of their relationship. That number of people have talked about it, really seemed like it brought them a lot closer together and made them much more of a loving couple after that event took place. I forgot to mention that earlier, but an interesting photo of the two of them. And this is President Kennedy. This is just a few weeks before he was killed in Dallas. He's driving through the streets of downtown Washington, D.C. And look, in this particular photo, he's actually standing up in the car. And you can see all the people that are out on the street. So again, the whole driving in an open convertible was not that unusual. This is actually a trip that Jacqueline Kennedy took without President Kennedy to India, and notice she's traveling in the open car and she's standing up. So there's no safety issues at that point in time, even in a different country. And then this is President Kennedy traveling through Ireland. And look at all these people. And this isn't even in the United States. You would think if you were concerned about the president, you'd be much more so in another country than you would be in the US. But look at, there's people, there's masses of people on the street. There's people up in the second and third floors. If you look in the center of the photo, in the middle, in the back, you can see people up on roofs and they're sticking out of windows. I mean, there just was a different era. We didn't have the hindsight of what was about to take place. This is actually the motorcade proceeding through Dallas. This is it again, proceeding through Dallas. Again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to type those in the Q&A. This is probably the most famous photo of the Kennedys, probably because it's a very clear photo. This is moments before the event took place. Now, this is the Texas School Book Depository. Now, initially, when I thought of doing this program, my plan was to actually, I've been there before. My plan was to go there again and take some photos and videos to show you in this presentation. But because of COVID, I decided not to do that. So at some point in time, however, I will do that and be happy to share that with you. The Lee Harvey Oswald was in the window where the red box is, up on the 6th floor of a 7-story building in downtown Dallas. Now, this is the route that we took. So this would be the view that Oswald basically would have had. And so if you see the yellow line over on the left side of the photo, the car basically came around the corner. It made a right turn, and then it's traveling down the road for like a block. Then it makes a left-hand turn and passes right by him. So he had a perfect view of this motorcade as it traveled by. The top right is a picture of the book depository itself. And the yellow circle is, of course, where President Kennedy was hit. This is another view of the angle he would have had. And this is the same type of picture, but just from a different angle. So if you look over to the right side where the blue arrow is, the car came down that street, and then you basically just follow the blue arrows. It goes a block, and then it turns left, and then it proceeds down, and you can see the book depository, the window he was at, and the shots raining down. Now, again, there's this fabulous museum in Dallas. It's called the 6th Floor Museum, and it's really a great site. And my plan was to show you pictures and videos from, because of COVID, I'm putting that on hold. So at some point in time, I will go there. I've been there before, but I'll go there again and take pictures and videos and be happy to share that with you as kind of like a virtual tour, because it's really an excellent historical facility. But because of COVID, I did not want to do that. These are pictures taken just seconds before President Kennedy was shot. There's Jacqueline Kennedy looking out the car. The Secret Service. It's so this is like a second or two before he was shot, and it's amazing to go to this site and stand here and just kind of imagine what it would have been like to be there that day. This is scenes from the famous Zapruder film. So we're not going to show this film. So one of the videos that I have at the end of the program, though, kind of talks about the history behind the video. I didn't show it just because it's a little graphic, and we have children on our program today. This is the camera that was used to take the famous film. Now, some people theorize that one of the problems that President Kennedy faced was let me back up. This is a historical photo. This is not President Kennedy when he was in Dallas. This was taken many years before he became president. This is from the mid 1950s. So this is like 8 years before Dallas. What happened was President Kennedy had a lot of back problems, and he ends up getting back surgery. And that did help, but the back problems continued on for the remainder of his life. And so the day that he was killed, he was actually wearing a pretty significant back brace. And some people theorize that that may have contributed to his death, because if he had heard the first shot, there was no way for him really to duck down very easy, because he's got this back brace. It's kind of keeping him locked in place, so to speak. And so his movement was severely restricted. And some people theorize that maybe that might have contributed to the fact that he was killed. It's the unproven theory. Some people say no, that was not a factor, and some people say yes, it definitely was. It's a big debate, but it's a debate nonetheless. I wanted to share that information with you. And again, this is a picture from 8 years before Dallas. This is when the shooting takes place. After the shooting starts, Secret Service man Clint Hill jumped on the back of the Kennedys' limousine to shield President and Mrs. Kennedy. And again, it's just amazing to go to this spot physically and see this. In fact, I actually, let me ask you guys, I'm curious to know how many of you have actually been to this site before. Let me do one more poll question. I'm just kind of curious to know how many of you have actually been to this site in Dallas before. So I'll leave this open for just a few seconds and let people answer, and then I'll share the results with you. It really is a moving place to see. It's It's worthwhile seeing, but it's also very difficult to be there, as you can imagine. Okay, I will go ahead and end that. And let's see. So, oh wow, almost a little over a quarter of the folks have been to the Dallas site. That's pretty impressive. And 27% yes, and 73% no. So if you haven't been there, or if you haven't been there in a while, at some point in time, we'll do a presentation on that, but we have to wait for COVID. And let me close that out. Here is the aftermath. Now, when you go and watch videos of the Kennedy assassination or read articles about it, there's always a huge number of people that chime in with all these conspiracy theories. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I pretty much just stick to the facts. If you are a conspiracy theorist and we're hoping to learn about how the CIA killed President Kennedy, or the Cubans, or Martians, or someone, sorry, I'm just strictly sticking to the facts. But there's a number of sites out there that have that kind of information. If that's what you're looking to, you usually just have to scroll through the earth is flat and we faked the moon landing articles to get to the Kennedy assassination alternative reality. Now, the car, what happened to the car? Well, it was actually used for a number of years, continued use. They actually converted it from a convertible to a hardtop and used it for many, many years after President Kennedy was killed. So imagine being driven around or in this car that was used to kill President Kennedy. But it's currently at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. Dearborn is a suburb of Detroit, where I grew up at. I've seen this car a number of times. They also, ironically, have the chair that Abraham Lincoln was sitting in when he was assassinated at Ford's Theater. And they also have the bus that Rosa Parks was arrested on. So if you get a chance and you're visiting the Detroit area or southeastern Michigan, make sure you check out Henry Ford Museum, and the car is there. This is a shocking photo. So the motorcade leaves the shooting scene and immediately changes direction and heads to Parkland Hospital. So again, they were going to the trademark where President Kennedy was to be delivering a speech there. I think this is just a very striking photo. You can see these people looking down the car. Everything happened so fast that they didn't have time to kind of secure the car, so to speak. You can see roses are hanging down in the seat. So just very shocking. And when she shows up, there's a lot of commotion taking place as far as what's going on, what's happening, da 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 da. The authorities are trying to keep people calm, keep things under control. And for a while, there's just news that President Kennedy's been brought here. He's been shot, but they don't really know, the kind of rank and file people that are standing outside, kind of what his condition is. So they're kind of milling about, waiting to see any kind of news updates on the president and anybody else that might have been shot. Governor Conley of Texas was also shot. But at some point in time, the doctors come out and announce that President Kennedy has died. Here's the timeline. So the items that are in black I showed you previously. So the kind of additions I've put in blue. So President Kennedy was shot at 12:30. The limousine arrived at Parkland Hospital just 6 minutes later. About 10 minutes after he was shot, Walter Cronkite goes and interrupts the regularly scheduled TV programming to announce that President Kennedy has in fact been shot. He didn't, at that point in time, he hadn't been pronounced dead. So the initial news announcement was just that President Kennedy has been shot by Walter Cronkite. But at 1 p.m., 30 minutes after President Kennedy was shot and 24 minutes after his limousine arrived at Parkland Hospital, the doctors announced that he had died. This, of course, it's a emotional outpouring of people that are in the hospital vicinity. There's just a huge number of striking photos of people reacting to the fact that President Kennedy has died. Now, Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and friend and close advisor, was actually at home when President Kennedy was shot. And this picture was taken just moments after he had heard his brother had been shot. A touching photo. He's being hugged by his children. Robert Kennedy received a phone call from J. Edgar Hoover informing him that his brother had been shot, but at that point in time, they didn't know his condition yet, or prognosis. After President Kennedy is killed, Lyndon Johnson is immediately escorted to Love Field because they don't know what's going on. Is this part of a larger conspiracy? If you think back to the Lincoln assassination, Secretary of State William Seward was severely attacked, and there was supposed to be an attack on the vice president. And so at this point in time, no one knows what's going on. So they want to get Johnson to Love Field and secure him there. Walter Cronkite comes on and breaks the news. I have this snippet with Walter Cronkite's announcement at the very end, if you want to stick around and listen to that. Now, remember these pictures where the Kennedys arrive at Love Field in Dallas. The sun is shining. They get off. They look very happy. They're a couple. So this is them arriving in Dallas. Let's look at the pictures of the departure. President Kennedy walks down the stairs, but is carried up the stairs in a casket. I really decided to do this presentation when I saw these two photos. And this is Jacqueline Kennedy walking up by herself. Let me back to the previous. You can see Jacqueline. She is in the kind of bottom right section of the photo. And again, I just kind of stumbled across these pictures when I was researching something else related to her. And when I saw these two pictures, I was just so moved by them. It prompted me to want to give you all this presentation. So thanks for joining us today. But again, a striking contrast between this and this. And Jacqueline having to climb the stairs by herself. Hold on for just 1 second while I check something on my computer. Okay, let's continue on. Thank you for your patience. Okay, the aftermath. What happened after the assassination? So here's the timeline. The newer items are in blue. So at 1:26, Lyndon Johnson departs Parkland Hospital for Love Field. At 1:50, Lee Harvey Oswald is captured. At 2:08, President Kennedy's body and Mrs. Kennedy depart Parkland Hospital. They left after Lyndon Johnson did. And then I'm going to show you pictures in a minute, but at 2:38, Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president aboard Air Force One. Talk more about that in just a second. Air Force One departs Love Field at 2:47 p.m. and at 5:58 East Coast time. All these other times are Central time or Dallas time, but at 5:58 p.m. Air Force One lands back at Andrews Air Force Base. So let's look at the progression. So if you go up towards the top, 12:30, President Kennedy is shot. 1 p.m., he's pronounced dead. At 2:38, 2 hours and 8 minutes after her husband is shot, this is Jacqueline Kennedy, and this is perhaps one of the most famous photos of her. And it's also probably the most famous photo of Lyndon Johnson. He's being sworn in on Air Force One. So Air Force One is not departed yet, but basically what happened was the entourage, Johnson's team, took him to the airport, thinking that might be a more secure location than the hospital, number one, and number two, they're knowing that they're going to have to get him out of there pretty soon. But he does not want to leave without Jacqueline. And she does not want to leave without her husband's body. And there's kind of a big spat between the local authorities and the Secret Service team. They want to take President Kennedy's body. The local authorities saying, no, you can't. We have to do an autopsy first. There's this kind of back and forth and a lot of interesting stories come out of that. But eventually, the local authorities relent or are coerced or whatever you want to say, and they get President Kennedy's body, they bring it to the plane, and it's loaded on board. I forgot to mention, let me go back. They actually had to break the handles off the casket to get it through the door. That was kind of an unusual aspect of the story. But again, so it's decided that before the plane takes off, that Lyndon Johnson should be sworn in as president, because again, no one knows what's going on. I mean, you kind of think about the immediate aftermath of 9/11. It kind of took quite a while for people to process what had happened. And the same thing with this event, but really striking photo of Jacqueline Kennedy and the poise and the composure that she's showing in this photo. When you go back to this and wow, her husband was shot at 12:30 p.m. This is her standing there 2 hours and 8 minutes later. So a remarkable fact that she's able to hold her composure together at that point in time, really extraordinary. Here's a colorized version. So this photo is black and white, but a lot of talented people take these famous black and white photo and colorize them so we can look at them kind of through a modern lens, so to speak. And then that's Lady Bird Johnson, Lyndon Johnson's wife, standing to his right, our left, in the yellow. But again, one of the most famous photos of Lyndon Johnson, one of the main famous photos of Jacqueline Kennedy, is probably one of the most famous photos, period, in American history. And this is snapped in the cabin of Air Force One. As you can imagine, it was a very emotional time. Jacqueline being hugged, and she still has the blood and other items from her husband on her clothing and her body. This is Air Force One. It eventually takes, this is not a picture from the day that the event took place. It's a historical photo of the Air Force One during the Kennedy era. So I would show you that. What happened to that plane? Well, it's at the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. So if you get a chance, you should go there and check that out. It's a great museum if you like aviation, airplanes, and all that kind of stuff. But that's where the plane, because this plane was used for a number of years after this event took place. And eventually the plane lands in Washington, D.C. at Andrews Air Force. Well, Andrews Air Force Base is not officially in Washington, D.C., but it's in the metro area. So suffice to say that they unload the president's body in the casket. And Jacqueline looks on. Now, she was greeted on the airplane. One of the first people on the airplane when it landed was Robert Kennedy. And supposedly when they met, the first thing that Jacqueline said to him was, "Oh God, Bobby." And then supposedly the first thing he said to her was, "Jackie, I'm here." And he held her hand, very touching. And you can see, it might be hard to tell depending on the size of the screen you have, but if you look and see the bottom of her suit, the dress part, you can see the dark color is blood. And of course, this was big news. Kennedy slain on Dallas Street. President Kennedy shot dead. Lyndon B. Johnson is sworn in. Kennedy is killed by sniper as he rides in car in Dallas. Johnson sworn in on plane. Shock, disbelief, and grief. So, you have to kind of think back to this point in time. They didn't have CNN and Facebook and, email and all this other stuff. News traveled very slowly, or much slower than it would today. So it kind of took quite a while for the whole story to get out with all the details. So, but it is interesting to go back and read through the kind of early news accounts. They didn't have all the information, so to speak. It takes a while to kind of process everything that happens. This is a famous photo or image of President Kennedy by Norman Rockwell. And the picture on the left was a magazine cover just prior to the election, and then they redid it for the memorial issue. So let's see, about a year ago, a gentleman came on one of my tours, and he said that he'd actually met President Kennedy on a number of occasions in his professional life. And he told me that this image by Norman Rockwell, to him, was the most lifelike representation of President Kennedy that he had ever seen, but done by an artist. So just whatever that's worth. This gentleman, again, he said he'd met President Kennedy. He believed this Norman Rockwell depiction of him was the most realistic. Now, what happened to Lee Harvey Oswald, the gentleman that was the perpetrator? Well, things did not work out good for him. He's actually shot and killed by Jack Ruby. This is a famous photo of him. So Oswald had been arrested a short time after the Kennedy assassination. He had, in between the time he killed President Kennedy and got arrested, he had also killed a local police officer. And I didn't really want the presentation to be about him. Whenever we do these types of programs, like when we do our Ford's Theater program, we don't spend a ton of time dwelling on John Wilkes Booth. We'd rather talk more about President Lincoln. Kind of same thing for this, but suffice to say, Lee Harvey Oswald was shot and killed by Jack Ruby. And someone wanted to point out that Jack Ruby is buried in Chicago. Now, Jack Ruby ended up going to jail for this, and he's kind of in this legal battle. And then he died a few years after this event took place. I always like it's an interesting facial and body expression of the gentleman on the left side of the photo to the right of Lee Harvey Oswald as he takes all this in. So again, this happens just very close to President Kennedy being killed. So it's just shocking news events taking place one after another. This is Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, again, if you want to learn more about the Kennedy assassination and just President Kennedy in general, if you go to Dallas, you should visit this site. It's called the 6th Floor Museum. And just have some excellent exhibits. And then it's also, of course, very worthwhile to kind of just walk around the area and kind of take in all the sights and sounds. Just a very moving experience, but also very educational. And of course, there's a memorial at the site for President Kennedy. This particular day was raining. That's a depiction of his son, John Jr., saluting him, which he did at the funeral. Now, this is the picture at Arlington National Cemetery, which, if you're not familiar with Washington, D.C., Arlington National Cemetery, it's kind of considered part of Washington, D.C., but it's actually in Arlington, Virginia, just across the Potomac River. And it has this spectacular view of Washington, D.C. In fact, it's probably one of the best views that you can get of Washington, D.C. is from Arlington Cemetery. And it's a really touching story that was accounted by Robert McNamara, who was the defense secretary for President Kennedy. What happens is President Kennedy travels to Arlington National Cemetery on Veterans Day, 1963, just 11 days before he was killed. He went there for an official event with Jacqueline, and he tells her that, looking out at this view, he says, "This place is so beautiful. I could stay here forever." And he would end up doing just that. He says that on November 11th, 1963, Veterans Day, just 11 days before he was killed. And so Jacqueline Kennedy and Robert McNamara play a big role in President Kennedy being buried at Arlington. His family, the Kennedys, wanted him to be buried back in Massachusetts. And most presidents, with 2 exceptions, are not buried at Arlington Cemetery. But Jacqueline really felt, as did Robert McNamara, that he should be buried at Arlington Cemetery. And so they make the big push to have that happen. And so that's a big reason why he's here. And instantly, Arlington Cemetery becomes this major tourist attraction. Here's some other photos of the funeral. I was going to have a separate program on the Kennedy funeral and his burial at Arlington Cemetery. But because various reasons, we have to put that on hold, and we'll do that at some point in time in the future. This is his body lying in state at the Capitol. Joe just asked, did you take these pictures yourself? I didn't take this one myself. This is from Life magazine. So these pictures, where I got them from was, a lot of them are in the public domain. Some of them I got from the John F. Kennedy Library and Museum. Some of them I got from the National Archives. Some of them I got from the 6th Floor Museum. Some of them I got from Time Magazine or the Washington Post. So just kind of a wide variety of public sources. This is President Kennedy's body being transported through the streets of Washington. And again, at some point in time, after the first year, we'll do a program about President Kennedy's funeral and the burial at Arlington. So it's a fascinating story, but for various reasons, we have to push that back a little bit. And this famous photo. And again, interesting, the Kennedys and their kind of role with media and photography and video and television, just so much of their administration captured in those media contexts. Arlington Cemetery. This was the initial burial plot. And then it was later decided this, so they needed something, they had to put President Kennedy, bury him right away, of course. But they knew it was going to be a big tourist attraction, and it was even more so than they expected. So later on, they turned it into more of a permanent site. So one of the top things to see at Arlington Cemetery. And this is the view of President Kennedy. And Jacqueline is buried beside him. If you see, there's 4 boxes here. So the one in the center right is President Kennedy. The one in the center left is Jacqueline Kennedy. Then there's 2 other smaller boxes. One of them is the body of their son, Patrick. Remember, he died 15 weeks before President Kennedy. And the other is a daughter that they supposedly were going to name Arabella. Jacqueline Kennedy had a difficult pregnancy history, and this particular daughter was stillborn. So there were 4 Kennedy children. One of them was stillborn. One of them died 39 hours after he was born, Patrick. The stillborn daughter was supposedly going to be named Arabella. And then, of course, the two children that lived on. And that's the Arlington house in the background. And it's the Eternal Flame. And Robert Kennedy, President Kennedy's brother, friend, advisor, and confidant, also buried at Arlington Cemetery. So it's nice that they're so close together. And if you are in Washington, D.C., sometimes when we are doing programs, someone will say, and you know, they don't mean any harm, and they just don't know. They say, how come there's no memorial to President Kennedy like there is for Abraham Lincoln or Thomas Jefferson or George Washington? There is. It's the Kennedy Center. So it's a little bit different of a memorial than what Lincoln and Washington and Jefferson had. But the memorial in Washington, D.C. to President Kennedy is the Kennedy Center. So what happened was the Washington, D.C. Center for the Performing Arts was something that was kind of thought of before President Kennedy came into office. Him and Jacqueline were very supportive of this endeavor. They put a lot of weight and used their influence to try and make this happen. And then when President Kennedy died, they decided to change the name of it to the Kennedy Center. So it's a living memorial. And it's a beautiful view at night. And Jacqueline passed away in 1994, 31 years after her husband. So I always think this is an interesting quote. So this was about a week and a half after President Kennedy was killed. Jacqueline sat down for an interview with a family friend who was also a reporter. And I always like to tell this story. She's the person who initiated the term Camelot, describing the Kennedy administration. That had not been used at any point in time during John F. Kennedy's life. In fact, if you were to somehow go back in time and meet him and ask him about Camelot, he would have no idea what you're talking about, at least in the kind of context that you would use, because that was not used during his lifetime, at least not publicly. Camelot was a musical that was popular during that point in time, maybe not quite the way Hamilton is, but still pretty popular nonetheless. And so Jacqueline Kennedy gives this interview about a week and a half after the death of her husband. And she says, quote, during the interview, President Kennedy was strongly attracted to Camelot because he was an idealist who saw history as something made by heroes like King Arthur. At night, before we'd go to sleep, Jack liked to play some records. And the song he loved the most came at the very end of this record, The Last Side of Camelot, which goes, don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment that was known as Camelot. And then she goes on to say, there will be great presidents again, but there will never be another Camelot. And with that, that is the end of our first part of our program. So I want to thank you for joining us. Hold on for 1 second.